She gave everything to save her brother, and lost him anyway. Years later she returned, not for forgiveness, but for vengeance. What happened next would silence an entire town. You ever notice how life seems to choose the worst possible moment to test you? For Maggie Carter, that moment came on a freezing Tuesday night, in a small Indiana town where the only thing colder than the wind was the way fate could turn on you without warning. She'd just finished a double shift at the diner, apron still tied, hands smelling faintly of coffee and bacon grease. Her feet ached, her eyes burned. All she wanted was to collapse on the couch and maybe watch a rerun of Wheel of Fortune. But the moment she stepped through the front door of her worn-down farmhouse, she knew something was wrong. Ethan, her 12-year-old boy, was sitting on the couch, hunched over, coughing so hard his whole body shook. His skin was pale, lips almost bluish. And when he lifted his head to look at her, there was blood on his hand. Her breath caught. The next hour blurred into flashing ER lights and the sharp smell of antiseptic. A doctor with tired eyes explained it. Ethan needed immediate surgery in Chicago, tonight. The procedure could save his life, but it came with a price tag, $15,000, cash up front. No insurance, no payment plan, $15,000. Maggie felt the number hit her like a punch to the chest. She had $300 in her checking account, maybe another $100 in tips at home. She didn't cry. Not yet. There wasn't time. She made calls in the hospital parking lot. Her sister in Ohio, sorry, bills are tight. An old friend, already behind on rent. The bank laughed politely. Her credit score wasn't even close to getting a loan. She even tried her boss at the diner, begging for an advance. He sighed and said the best he could do was let her pick up more shifts next week. Next week wouldn't matter. Ethan didn't have next week. By midnight, she was out of options, and that's when she thought of him. Charles Whitmore. The man who could make anything happen in this town if you were willing to pay the price. Former mayor, real estate tycoon, and the owner of the largest Victorian estate for 50 miles in any direction. People whispered about the favors he demanded in return for his help, but no one ever spoke too loud. Maggie didn't have a choice. The drive to his estate was silent, except for the hum of the heater and the occasional cough from the back seat, where Sam, her 16-year-old daughter, sat with Ethan, keeping him warm under a blanket. Maggie's knuckles were white on the steering wheel. She prayed she was wrong about what she'd heard over the years. Whitmore answered the door himself, wearing a silk robe and holding a glass of whiskey. His smile was slow, practiced. She told him everything, her voice shaking, words spilling over themselves. The hospital, the surgery, the $15,000. She promised she would pay him back. She could clean his house, work his land, anything. He listened, sipping his drink. When she was done, he leaned back against the doorframe. "I'll give you the money," he said finally. Relief washed over her, but then his eyes drifted past her shoulder. "On one condition." The words were smooth, but they cut through the cold night air like a blade. He wanted her daughter. Sam, for one night. Maggie felt her stomach drop. "You can't be serious," she whispered. But he was. Completely. She turned and walked away, anger and disgust burning through her. But when she reached the car and saw Ethan, slumped in Sam's lap, struggling for each breath, her resolve began to crack. What was the value of one night compared to a lifetime? What was her daughter's innocence worth? If it meant her son could live? She told herself she'd find another way. She'd pawn the car, beg strangers, do anything. But time was running out, and Ethan's condition was getting worse by the minute. The moment came in their kitchen, 15 minutes later. Sam sat at the table, eyes wide as her mother explained. Maggie's voice broke halfway through. She begged. She told Sam she wouldn't ask unless there was no other choice. Sam cried, shaking her head. "Mom, no." But when she looked toward Ethan's room, when she heard the sound of his labored breathing, something in her broke too. She agreed. Maggie drove her back to Whitmore's estate. The air inside his house smelled of expensive cologne and old money. She left Sam there, forcing herself not to look back as she walked out. The guilt was already crushing her chest. An hour later, Whitmore handed her an envelope. Thick, heavy, $15,000 in cash. She didn't thank him. She couldn't. She just drove. The road to Chicago stretched ahead like a dark ribbon under the weak glow of the headlights. Sam sat silent in the back seat beside Ethan, staring out the window. Maggie tried not to notice the way she held her arms tight around herself, as if trying to hold something in. Halfway there, Ethan stirred. Maggie glanced back, just in time to see his eyes flutter shut. She pulled over, shaking him, calling his name. No response. His chest had gone still. On that lonely stretch of highway with trucks roaring past, Maggie Carter held her son's lifeless body and screamed until her voice broke. By the time they reached the hospital, it was too late. The next morning, the town gathered at the cemetery. The winter wind cut through black coats and whispered through bare trees. Maggie stood at the graveside, staring down at the small coffin. Sam stood beside her, face blank, eyes dry. When the last clump of earth fell, Maggie reached for her daughter's hand. Sam didn't take it. She just turned and walked away, her gaze fixed on the horizon. That was the moment Maggie realized she hadn't just lost Ethan, she had lost Sam too. Not physically, but in a way that might be permanent. And somewhere deep inside that young woman, in a place no one could reach, a seed of hatred had been planted. One day, it would grow. And that day was coming. 10 years. That's how long it had been since that freezing night in Indiana, the night that took Ethan, shattered Maggie Carter, and turned Samantha into something colder, sharper. Chicago had a way of reshaping people. The Sam who now walked its streets was nothing like the frightened 16-year-old who once sat silently in the back of a car, clutching her coat around herself after the worst night of her life. She was 26 now, sleek, polished, and untouchable. A rising star in one of the city's most prestigious financial consulting firms. Her hair was always perfect, her clothes, designer, her tone, calm, calculated. In meetings, she could dismantle a client's bad strategy with the same precision a surgeon used to remove a tumor. People respected her. Some feared her. But no one knew what had built her. Well, no one except Maggie. Her mother still lived back in Indiana, working part-time at a grocery store, stacking shelves under fluorescent lights that made her look even older than her years. The guilt had never left Maggie. You could see it in the way she carried herself. Shoulders slightly hunched, eyes never quite meeting yours. Sam still called her, sometimes. But the conversations were short, transactional. Birthdays, holidays, the bare minimum. Forgiveness wasn't on the table. Sam saw her as a participant in her own destruction. The fact that Maggie had been desperate, that she'd been trying to save Ethan, none of it mattered. In Sam's mind, her mother had made a choice, and Sam had been the price. Whitmore, though. Charles Whitmore had thrived. No longer mayor, he had retired into a new role, the celebrated philanthropist. He gave scholarships to promising students, cut ribbons at hospitals, posed for photos with governors and senators. His smile was on billboards for local charities. On paper, he was untouchable. In public, he was admired. But for Sam, every photo of him was like a knife. She couldn't even watch the evening news without that same slow burn rising in her chest. Then came the night that would change everything. It was late October when her boss handed her a last-minute assignment, attend a high-profile charity gala to mingle with potential clients. She didn't even check the guest list. She had no reason to. The venue was pure luxury, a grand ballroom draped in white and gold, crystal chandeliers throwing warm light over tables of polished silverware and champagne flutes. The air smelled faintly of roses and expensive perfume. Sam moved easily among the crowd, shaking hands, trading business cards, offering that polite, professional smile she'd mastered, and then she saw him. Charles Whitmore. He was standing near the stage, surrounded by politicians and business leaders, his hand resting on the shoulder of a state senator as he laughed at some joke. His suit was custom-tailored, dark charcoal with a subtle sheen. On his wrist, a diamond-studded watch that glittered every time it caught the light. Sam froze. 10 years collapsed into one instant. She wasn't in Chicago anymore. She was back in Indiana, standing on that cold porch while he named his price. Her fingers tightened around her champagne glass. She could have left. She could have avoided him. But she didn't move. Something in her wanted to see what time had done to him, and more importantly, what time had not. Whitmore noticed her before she could slip away. He stepped forward, smiling in that same slow, deliberate way. For a moment there was a flicker of confusion in his eyes, as if trying to place her. And then, recognition. His smile widened. "Well," he said softly, leaning close so only she could hear. Some debts are worth every penny. It was like he'd reached inside her and twisted something that had been buried deep. Every wall she'd built over the past decade shook under the weight of those words. He didn't apologize. He didn't look ashamed. He was proud. Sam didn't respond. She just stared at him for a long, cold moment, then turned and walked away. But inside her head, something had shifted. For years she'd survived by moving forward, by refusing to look back. But in that moment, she realized something. Moving forward wasn't enough. Because as long as he walked free, as long as he smiled and shook hands and took credit for helping people, there would always be a part of her that was still 16 years old, sitting in that back seat, feeling powerless. And she was not powerless anymore. When she got home that night, she stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling window of her downtown apartment, looking out over the glittering city. She didn't turn on the lights. She didn't take off her heels. In her mind, she saw him again, the watch, the smug smile, the glass of whiskey. She remembered her mother's tearful voice, the way Ethan had looked in those final moments, the numb silence in the car. She thought about how much Whitmore valued his reputation, his power, his legacy. And that was when she made the decision. She wouldn't just ruin him financially. That would be too easy, too clean. No, she would take everything, his fortune, his influence, his family's respect, and she would do it slowly so he could feel it happening, piece by piece, until the man who once held all the cards was left with nothing but the memory of what he'd lost. She picked up her phone and began making calls. Not to friends, Sam didn't have friends. To contacts, people in real estate, politics, business, people who owed her favors. The war had begun. But what Sam didn't know was that Whitmore's empire was built on more than just money. It was built on secrets, secrets that had ruined people before. And stepping into his world again would mean walking into a web, one she might not escape from unscathed. Because when you go hunting for monsters, sometimes you find out they've been hunting you all along. Revenge, Sam Carter had learned, was not about rage. Rage burned too hot, too fast. It left you empty before the work was done. Real revenge was about patience, precision, and the willingness to become the spider, waiting for the fly to land in your web. For weeks after the gala, she worked in silence. By day, she was the polished consultant closing deals in glass-walled boardrooms. By night, she was something else entirely, a hunter charting every thread of Charles Whitmore's empire. Whitmore's world was a fortress of golf courses, charity banquets, and offshore trusts. But every fortress had a weakness, and Sam found hers in the form of Daniel Whitmore, Charles's only son still involved in the family business. Daniel was 32, handsome, and, most importantly, lonely. His father's shadow had made it hard for him to trust people. But Sam knew how to make people trust her. It started with a chance meeting at the Oak Ridge Country Club, one of Chicago's most exclusive. Sam had done her research. Daniel played tennis there every Saturday morning. So did one of her clients. A quick introduction, a few shared jokes over bad espresso in the lounge. And by the third weekend, Daniel was inviting her to join his table for lunch. From there, she moved carefully. She never asked about his father at first, only about his business, his own struggles running part of the real estate portfolio. She listened more than she spoke. She let him feel like the smartest man in the room. By the time autumn rolled in, Daniel was calling her for advice, little things at first. Investment timing, a questionable land deal in Florida. She gave him good counsel, earned his confidence, and then began asking for access. Just small files, for context. One folder became 10, 10 became 20, and soon she had everything she needed to begin dismantling Charles Whitmore's life. What she found was worse than she expected. Hidden among the legitimate transactions were shell corporations in the Cayman Islands, accounts in Belize, and paper trails leading to bribery payments to city officials. There were wire transfers marked only with first names, each one matching an alleged victim whose silence had been bought years earlier. It was all there. The crimes, the cover-ups, the lies. And Sam realized something chilling. Whitmore hadn't just destroyed her family. He had done this to others. Again and again, and had gotten away with it. One evening, she drove back to Indiana. Maggie answered the door looking tired, her hair streaked with more gray than Sam remembered. They sat at the kitchen table, the same one where they'd once eaten frozen dinners as a family of four. Sam laid out some of the documents in front of her. "I'm going to take him down, Mom. Completely. And when I'm done, no one will even remember him as a man worth shaking hands with." Maggie looked at the papers, her hands trembling. "Sam, revenge doesn't bring peace, it eats you alive from the inside." Sam didn't flinch. "Good, let it eat. I'm not looking for peace." Maggie tried again. "He's not worth your soul." But Maggie's own eyes betrayed her. She didn't truly believe she had the right to stop her. Her guilt had sealed her silence. Back in Chicago, Sam began to pull threads. She fed select files to an investigative journalist she trusted, just enough to create whispers without revealing her full hand. Politicians began asking quiet questions. Local TV news ran vague segments about potential financial irregularities tied to the Whitmore Foundation. At first, Charles ignored it, but then, one by one, some of his closest allies began stepping back. A bank froze one of his accounts, pending review. A charity delayed his keynote speech. The web was tightening, and then came the twist Sam hadn't planned for. A contact inside one of Whitmore's holding companies tipped her off. Charles had been making unusually large medical payments in cash. Sam dug deeper. What she found almost made her laugh. Charles Whitmore, the man who had once stood in her kitchen demanding her body as payment, was dying. Advanced kidney failure. He was on dialysis 3 times a week. He needed a transplant, and soon. But here was the best part. His legitimate children wanted nothing to do with him. Years of control, manipulation, and betrayal had left him with a family name, but no real family. And to make matters worse, the IRS had frozen millions of his assets. He was rich, but not liquid. Trapped. Sam stood by her apartment window that night. The city spread beneath her like a sea of glittering opportunities. She could finish him now. She had enough evidence to send him into a permanent legal spiral. But a new idea had taken root. Something darker, more personal. She could take away not just his freedom, not just his fortune, but the one thing he needed to survive. Her lips curved into the faintest smile. Whitmore had once made her choose between her brother's life and her own innocence. Now, she would make him choose between his pride and his life. The next move would be risky. She'd have to get closer. Close enough to make him believe she was the only person who could save him. Close enough to dangle hope in front of him. Then rip it away. But Sam had been waiting 10 years for this. And as any spider knows, the closer the fly comes to the center of the web, the harder it is to escape. What Sam didn't realize was that Whitmore had already noticed her moves. And while she thought she was weaving the perfect trap, he had just set one of his own. Because Charles Whitmore may have been dying, but he wasn't dead yet. The storm rolled over Lake Michigan like a living thing, black clouds clawing across the sky, wind tearing at the treetops, rain pelting the dark water until it frothed white. At the very edge of that storm stood Charles Whitmore's mansion, 3 stories of stone and arrogance, set back behind an iron gate. Inside, the lights flickered against the gloom, and the man who once ruled this town now sat hunched in a high-backed leather chair, a blanket over his knees, his breath shallow. Whitmore was dying. His name was in the papers again, but not the way he liked. Whitmore under IRS investigation. Philanthropist linked to offshore accounts. Sources say former mayor in declining health. His money was locked away. His political allies had abandoned him. His children had stopped calling. And now, he was desperate enough to call the one person he never thought he'd need. Sam Carter. She arrived just after dusk. The storm had begun to scream against the windows, the lake thrashing against the rocks below. A butler led her through a long hallway lined with oil paintings. Portraits of Whitmore's ancestors, stern men and cold-eyed women staring down from their frames. When she stepped into the study, he was waiting. Time had not been kind to Charles Whitmore. His skin hung loose on his frame, the once commanding voice now cracked and thin. But his eyes, those cold blue eyes, they still searched her the way they had 10 years ago. "Sam," he rasped, as if they were old friends. "You came." She didn't sit. "You said it was urgent." He coughed, the sound wet and heavy. "You know what's happening to me, the doctors, the transplant list. I don't have time. You have the contacts, the money. You could make it happen." Sam let the silence stretch. She studied him like a specimen under glass. Finally, she said, "You don't recognize me, do you?" His brow furrowed. "Should I?" She stepped closer, the stormlight flashing against her face. "You stood in my kitchen," she said quietly, "and told my mother you'd give her $15,000 if I spent the night with you." The air in the room seemed to vanish. Whitmore's eyes narrowed. "You're her?" "I'm the girl," Sam said. "The girl who thought she was saving her little brother. The girl you bought. Ethan died on the way to the hospital that night. You didn't just take my innocence, you took it for nothing." Whitmore looked away, his jaw tight. "That was a long time ago." Sam laughed, a sharp, humorless sound. "For you. I've been counting the days." She moved to the desk and placed a crisp, blank check on the polished wood. "I'll pay for your surgery. I'll pay for the best care in the country. I'll make sure you live long enough to see your name scrubbed from every building, every foundation, every plaque. But there's one condition." Whitmore's eyes flicked to the check, then back to her. "Name it." "You kneel," Sam said. "Right here, right now, and you confess. To me. To the world. You tell the truth about what you did to me, and to all the others you've paid to keep quiet." The storm howled outside. The grandfather clock ticked like a metronome between them. Whitmore's lips trembled, from weakness, from anger, from pride. "I don't kneel to anyone." Sam leaned in. "Then you die." She turned, her heels echoing against the marble floor as she walked out. The butler's eyes followed her to the door, but no one stopped her. And when the gates clanged shut behind her, Sam didn't look back. 2 weeks later, the headlines told the story. Charles Whitmore dead at 71, former mayor, philanthropist, leaves complicated legacy. The article spoke of his political career, his charitable contributions, the investigations that had tarnished his final years. They didn't speak of the truth. They never would. But Sam knew. On a gray morning, she drove to the cemetery on the outskirts of town. The grass was wet with rain. Whitmore's grave was fresh, the headstone bare except for his name and the years of his life. Sam stood over it for a long time, saying nothing. Then she took a folded check from her coat pocket, $15,000, and laid it gently on the soil. "Debt paid in full," she whispered. From the edge of the cemetery, Maggie watched. Her hands were stuffed deep in her coat pockets, her face pale against the wind. When Sam turned to leave, their eyes met. No forgiveness passed between them. But something else did, a recognition that the circle was closed, the debt settled. They would never be what they once were. But for the first time in 10 years, neither of them owed the other anything. Sam walked away, the wind catching her hair, the world opening before her. Revenge had been sweet, but it hadn't been healing. The void was still there and always would be. And maybe that was the real price of mercy. Sometimes justice doesn't come in courtrooms or with apologies. Sometimes it's paid in the quiet of a cemetery, with nothing but the wind to bear witness. If this story gripped you, if you felt every twist, every shadow, make sure to hit subscribe, tap the bell icon, and share this video with someone who loves stories that leave you thinking long after the credits roll. Because there are more tales like this, and you don't want to miss the next one.